In the late medieval world, surrender was often the difference between survival and destruction. Cities that opened their gates could negotiate. They could preserve their people, their structures, and sometimes even their autonomy. But cities that refused, those that resisted, faced something far worse. And in 1453, one city made that choice. Constantinople had stood for centuries as one of the most powerful and symbolic cities in the world. It was not just a capital. It was a barrier, a dividing line between empires, religions, and continents. For the Ottoman Empire, it represented something unfinished. For decades, they had surrounded it, weakened it, waited for the right moment. And now, under Sultan Mehmed II, that moment had arrived. Mehmed was not an ordinary ruler. He was young, but focused, ambitious in a way that made his intentions clear. He did not come to negotiate. He came to take the city. But even then, tradition demanded something first. An offer. The Ottomans gave Constantinople a choice: surrender and avoid destruction, resist and face the consequences. Inside the city, the situation was clear. The defenders were outnumbered. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements were uncertain at best. The Byzantine Empire, once vast and powerful, had been reduced to little more than the city itself. And yet, despite all of this, they refused. Why? Because Constantinople had survived sieges before. Its walls, massive, layered, and reinforced, had held back armies for centuries. They were considered nearly impenetrable. The defenders believed that if they could hold long enough, help might come, that the city could endure, just as it had in the past. But this time was different, because the army outside the walls was not like the ones before it, and the man leading it was not interested in waiting. The Ottomans did not begin with chaos. They began with preparation. Every movement was calculated, every position chosen with purpose. Mehmed II understood that Constantinople's strength lay in its walls, and if those walls could be broken, the city would fall. It was a simple idea, but achieving it required something new. Artillery. Massive cannons were brought to the battlefield, weapons unlike anything the defenders had faced before. These were not ordinary siege tools. They were designed specifically to destroy what had once been considered indestructible. When they fired, the sound echoed across the land. The ground itself seemed to shake. The first impacts were shocking. Stone cracked. Dust filled the air. Sections of the walls that had stood for centuries, began to show signs of failure. But the defenders did not collapse. Each night, they worked to repair the damage, reinforcing broken sections, rebuilding what had been lost. They adapted as quickly as they could, trying to keep up with a threat they had never encountered before. The Ottomans increased the pressure. More bombardment, more attacks, more force. This was no longer a siege of endurance. It was a siege of destruction. And with every passing day, the balance began to shift. Weeks of bombardment had done what centuries of war could not. The walls began to fail. At first, it was small cracks, then larger fractures. Eventually, entire sections weakened beyond repair. The defenders could no longer keep up. Every repair was temporary. Every fix delayed the inevitable. The Ottomans saw the change immediately, and they acted. Coordinated assaults began. Not random attacks, but organized waves designed to exploit the weakest points. Soldiers advanced under covering fire. Ladders were raised. Breaches were targeted again and again. The defenders fought back with everything they had: fire, stones, blades. Every opening became a battlefield. Every step inside the walls had to be earned. But numbers matter, and exhaustion builds. The defenders were running out of both. Then came the moment that changed everything. A section of the wall collapsed completely. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. And through that opening, the army moved in. When the Ottomans finally broke through the walls of Constantinople, the battle did not end. It changed form. What had been a siege became something far more chaotic, far more dangerous. Inside the city, structure collapsed almost instantly. Defensive lines that had held for weeks could not survive the sudden shift from controlled resistance to open invasion. Streets that once served as pathways for movement turned into battlegrounds. Every corner, every building, every narrow passage became part of the conflict. The defenders fought where they could, but coordination was gone. Units were separated. Command chains broke down. What remained was individual resistance. Small groups, isolated fighters, scattered attempts to slow what could no longer be stopped. The Ottoman forces moved forward with momentum, pushing deeper into the city with each passing moment. But what followed was not immediate order. For a period of time, control was not the priority. The soldiers, having endured weeks of resistance, were released into the city. This was not unusual in the context of medieval warfare. It was expected. A city that refused to surrender would face consequences beyond defeat. The refusal itself carried a cost, and that cost was now being paid. Buildings were entered by force. Valuables were taken. Fires broke out in multiple areas, some accidental, others not. The sound of combat was replaced by something else: shouting, movement, confusion. Civilians who had remained within the city now faced the reality of what resistance had brought. Some tried to hide. Others attempted to flee. Few succeeded. This was not a coordinated strategy. It was the absence of one. And in that absence, violence filled the space. From the perspective of the Ottoman command, this moment served a purpose. It reinforced a message that extended far beyond Constantinople itself. Resistance would not be negotiated. It would be punished. Not selectively, not symbolically, but visibly. The outcome needed to be clear enough that future cities would understand the choice before making it. The defenders had believed their walls would hold. That time would work in their favor. That history would repeat itself. But history does not always repeat. Sometimes it shifts. And when it does, the consequences are immediate. What happened inside Constantinople was not just the fall of a city. It was the demonstration of a rule. And that rule would be remembered. When order was finally restored, Constantinople no longer existed as it had before. The city had not simply been taken, it had been transformed. The Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for over 1,000 years, ended in a matter of hours. Its final resistance, its last decision to refuse surrender, had shaped the way it would be remembered. For Sultan Mehmed II, the victory was complete. The objective had been achieved. The city that had stood as a barrier between empires was now under his control. But beyond the strategic and political outcome, there was something else, something equally important. A message. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military event. It was a signal sent across regions, across cultures, across future conflicts. It demonstrated that no city, no matter how strong its walls or how long its history, was beyond reach. It showed that resistance, when faced with overwhelming force and new technology, could lead not just to defeat, but to irreversible consequences. Across Europe, the reaction was immediate. News of the fall spread quickly, carried by merchants, travelers, and survivors. The details varied, but the core of the story remained consistent. A city had refused to surrender. A powerful army had answered that refusal, and the result had been decisive. Fear was one response. Respect was another. Because the Ottomans had not just taken a city, they had changed the perception of what was possible. For future cities facing similar decisions, the choice became clearer, but also more difficult. Surrender meant survival, but at a cost. Resistance meant risk, not just of defeat, but of something far greater. And that is the lasting impact of Constantinople. It was not just a turning point in history. It was a definition of consequence. The defenders chose to resist, and in doing so, they defined what resistance would mean in the face of an empire that did not stop.